Hi, folks. We're Tacitus today, your pushback channel, and thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about what value do mass migrants bring to the West. And they've been, because it started in Europe, give or take about 30 years ago. And so there's quite a few studies that have been conducted that really shine a light on how well these mass migrants are being assimilated, integrated, how many of them want to assimilate or integrate, how many of them are just parasiting off the rich white welfare state, how many of them are contributing, how many of them are adding value, how many of them are bringing skills that are helpful or needed or whatever. So this is an interesting one. Now, there have been a few studies around the world, some in Australia, by the way, but unless they cast the mass migration thing in a very, very positive, gushing positive light, they tend to bury them. So if they're negative about mass migration, these studies, they tend to bury them or just quietly let them fall down the back of the filing cabinet or something. Now, then some years ago in Australia, there was a study done. It was a government study, and they concluded that less than 5% of the mass migrants coming into Australia were of any economic benefit to the country, less than 5%. So I think that particular year there were approximately, say, 300,000, give or take, migrants coming in, and they estimated that about 12,000 were actually people that spoke good English, had internationally recognized qualifications, credentials, and experience, and could pretty much walk straight into a job, in an area where there were skill shortages, whether they be temporary or whatever. Some of the skill shortages are a huge stretch. They say, well, we want a rocket scientist to live in the middle of nowhere in some shitbox hovel for crap money. We can't find somebody, skill shortage. And that's not a skill shortage. If they made the position, the pay and conditions of the position attractive enough, there'd be plenty of local people who would take it. So it's very different. There's a big different skill shortage. We want to pay the lowest of the low wage. We can't find anybody. That's not a skill shortage. But coming back to the European studies of this now, this is a study, or a couple of studies actually, out of Scandinavia. So, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland, that sort of thing. Primarily, this is a Swedish-Danish gig, or two studies from those places. Now, at the beginning of the mass migration, there was a mix of refugees, asylum seekers, and so on. The bar at the time was set very low for what would constitute a refugee or an asylum seeker. Basically, you just self-declare. And there was already that international infrastructure of mass people movement being put in place. So these supposed migrants being told, well, if you go down the migration path, it's a higher bar that you have to meet. But if you say you're a refugee or you're a black lesbian or something like that, it's a much lower bar and you've got a much better chance of getting in. So they were coached in all this sort of stuff, and they went along. So the quality of refugees and asylum seekers is lower than, or used to be lower than the bar that would be set for a migrant. This has now changed. In the late 1990s in Australia, there was in early 2000s, there was all this screaming about skill shortages, and the government assured us that only people that speak good English and have, superb qualifications, credentials will be allowed in. So don't worry, we're not going to be overrun. It's only going to be rocket scientists and so on. This proved to be an outrageous and grotesque untruth. The people coming in from China couldn't speak a word of fucking English. They had no qualification. They were just rural peasants who couldn't even wash dishes without a training course. So no, this idea of people being brought in, the highest quality migrants, that was bullshit. So that the bar was set so low for migrants that they were almost indistinguishable from asylum seekers and so on. Now, in addition to diluting the quality of the people, a lot of the government in Australia, as they do in the United States, allows millions of people to come in on what's called chain migration, or family reunion, as it's called in Australia. So when one person from a supposed family gets into Australia and gets citizenship or permanent residence, they then are legally able to bring in all their relatives. Now, these people don't just have one relative like a wife or something like that. They have a gazillion relatives, and cousins, aunts, uncles, parents, fucking nephews, nieces. I mean, the whole. So their family group is like 1 million people. They bring out the whole fucking village, and especially where in places like Afghanistan, where brothers and sisters and cousins are procreating and marrying, then it literally means you bring out the entire clan, the entire village, because they're all interrelated in some way, and they all come out. So something like 40% or 45% of the total migrant intake back in this year when they did this study was the family reunion, chain migration. And the requirement, the bar that's set, it's not set very high anyway. The bar that's set for migrants is set. There is no bar for bringing these people. They can't speak a lick. They can have an IQ of -5 million, no skills, no nothing, and they're still allowed to come in on sort of assumed and imagined humanitarian grounds. So coming to these studies now, the quality of people isn't high. There's no high bar. Again, this is what irritates the crap out of me. When you look at, say, migration to Australia in the 1960s, 1970s, that sort of thing, and you look at the ship's manifest, because mostly shipping those days, you look at the ship's manifest, and then you go down it, and what are the qualifications of the people? Then you're looking at carpenter, bricklayer, plumber, electrician, carpenter, nurse, architect, builder, and accountant, and so on and so forth. There's very few people that don't have some sort of qualification. There were dispensations where one family had like 8 children or something, and they didn't look like they were qualified, but they had 8 children. So that was kind of, well, that's the benefit. You're bringing out 8 kids that'll become Australians. English was pretty much mandatory, and there are a few people. There was a guy who was from Serbia, but he was a bricklayer or something. So his English was deemed as being not so good, but at least he was qualified. So you look at then you look at the equivalent manifest today, where people have got no skills, qualification, they got nothing. They don't speak English. They're just fucking useless from everything. But so the quality of people that you choose at the outset has a huge implication to how well they integrate, what value they add, and so on. In the Australian study, less than 5% of the people coming in as migrants were considered economically valuable, and I think the same holds all around the world here. Anyway, here's these couple of studies done in Scandinavia. Again, they're mainly Swedish and Danish. I think there's one Norwegian in here, but anyway, this is an amalgam of those studies. So there's 500 supposed asylum seeker refugees and migrants that came into, I think this one's in Denmark, actually, this particular number I'm looking at here. 500 came into, I'll say Denmark, but it could be Sweden. Probably doesn't make any difference, really. But 500 came in, and they're all men, and there was no bar set to their education. Could they speak any language other than the Arabic language that they from their land that they came from? There was no questions as to, hold on, why did you travel through 15 different countries to get here? That seemed to be ignored, which I think is materially important. Why was it you were in a refugee camp run by the United Nations? Why did you end up deciding to come here? Well, just because we've got generous welfare benefits. Who told you about that? You're almost illiterate in your own language, for goodness sakes. How did you discover this? You couldn't read about it. Someone must have told you. Who? Was it agitators from the United Nations that put you up to this? There's no vetting procedures. They were just waved in the door, and they come from very different culture, third world culture. Again, many are illiterate in their own language. Their IQs, none of them would have had an IQ above 90. Many would have been around the 70s. But what happened to them after they arrived? Now, all of them got permission to import brides from their country of origin. So they all arrive as single men. Then they all bring out the brides. So 500 men then bring out another 500 women from their failed state shithole that they came from. Why was that even allowed? But anyway, so already they've cemented these people into the niche of, you know, the ghetto, if you like, just by that alone. Now, since they've arrived 30 years ago, 70% have been convicted of crimes. Many of those serious crimes, such as murder and so on. Now, they often are murdering each other, so that's perceived to be, oh, well, you know, that's how it is. But also many Scandinavian people have been murdered as well. 60% have been on welfare for the entire 30 years that they've been in Denmark. They've had an average of 3.7 children each. This is the ones on welfare, 3.7 children each, all of whom have been on welfare. All the entire, you know, medical expenses, everything has all been paid for by the welfare state of these people. Of the first generation that are Scandinavian born, and they had, in order to anchor baby themselves in, they procreate immediately and aggressively. And so most of the first generation, they all have a lot of children. The first generation of Scandinavian born are now in their, you know, late 20s, and 55% of those have been convicted of crimes. And 40% of those have been welfare dependent since birth and to their current age. Now already, because they procreate quite a young age, the second generation local born, Scandinavian born, this is from these people, is not faring much better. You know, there's a lot of teen criminals amongst those, and they don't seem to be working or performing at school or anything like that. So they're going to be a problem as well. So the first generation, 70% commit crimes. This is the first generation arriving from these third world countries. Then the first generation local born, 55% of them commit crimes. And again, the amount of teen criminals from now the second generation local born is already at 40%. So, and the welfare dependency is still very high. Now, 60% of them that arrive have been welfare dependent non-stop for 30 years. And the first generation born have also got a high level of welfare, very high level of welfare dependency, like 4 times what the local population is. And just to sort of soften the blow a little bit, the statisticians include retired senior citizen people amongst the local white population. So, well, see, they're only 3 or 4 times more. But if you take out the senior citizen retirement on welfare benefits, then you're looking at 7, 8, 9 times the amount of dependency on welfare that the local population has. So it'd be difficult to illustrate or to demonstrate such a spectacular failure as this. So how do you then avoid this? How do you avoid it happening? We just have to have a higher quality of immigrant coming in. That doesn't matter whether you call them a refugee or an asylum seeker or an immigrant or whatever you call them. It doesn't matter. But if you want to bring these anyone in as a migrant, they have to speak the local language or the international language. You know, like many people in Scandinavia speak English. So you know, someone that spoke good English could maybe get away with it. You know, in Norway, if you want to work for a lot of the public service, a lot of the government departments, you have to speak the local Norwegian language and Swedish, for example. So there's quite a high bar for getting jobs. Why isn't that high bar or similar high bar applied to migrants? So they have to be able to contribute economically or have the capacity to contribute economically to the economy and to the society. And anyone that can't, or if they've got an IQ of 70, they're never going to get there. Anyone that can't, it comes from a very different culture and very different behavioural set of beliefs. They're just not going to integrate. A tiny proportion of them might, but they're just not going to. And again, I'll highlight this, and I keep saying this in my videos, that Indians who are seven generations Western born still regard themselves as Indians, still send back to the village of their ancestors for husbands and brides, still live in enclaves and so on and so forth, still only hang out with Indians for social, they're the most diabolically bad, if you assume integration, assimilation is important, they're the most diabolically bad immigrants you can possibly have. But unless you go for a high quality of immigrant, unless must speak the language, must have qualifications, must have relevant experience and so on, unless you go for a high quality immigrant, you're just not going to get that sort of assimilation, integration, and where the migrant delivers some sort of economic value. Now, saying that, I noticed this in Sydney, the Sydney, Australia, where if I go in early on the public transport into the downtown area, I'm surrounded often by Asian midgets, people who are 4'8" tall, 145 centimeters tall. All of them seem to have, rickets and various other childhood ailments. But they all work in the takeout food shops and the slave labor type jobs. Now these are businesses that are not economically viable if they have to pay the proper legally mandated wage. So they get these third world illiterate peasants to work for slave labor wages. They bring them in under scam labor hire firms. So there's this entire section of the Australian economy that is non-viable in any commercial legal sense, but is only being propped up through use of slave labour. Why do we even tolerate that? And there are massive. I can walk down an arcade, a food takeout food, another retail store's arcade, one that goes on for nearly a kilometre, and both sides of the thing, shops and food stores on both sides, and not see a single white person for a kilometre working in any of these shops. I mean, that's the extent of the fraud that's being perpetrated upon us and in the West, and they're bringing in low IQ, illiterate, rural peasants to work in these jobs. It's slave labour, for fuck's sake. But the value, again, if a valuable contribution is going to be made to the Western economies, then the quality of people, they have to be higher IQ, they have to be qualified, they have to be urbanized, they have to speak the language. Otherwise, it's a waste of time, as illustrated here. So 30 years down the track, with the second generation of local born already, in their teens, and already the crime rate of these teens is way beyond any of the local white people. I mean, who would want that? Why import so many problems? There's no benefit to it. Nothing's being achieved. Nothing's being accomplished. And there's a negative outcome for the Western countries in every imaginable and conceivable way, whether it be crime rates, no-go zones because of the crime, ethnic enclaves, or people who are a lifetime dependent on welfare. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.